I'll be speaking with Kathy Kelly of Voices for Creative Nonviolence. She and several score others have just finished up a week of fasting to protest the war against the Yemenis. Good morning.
Good morning, Stanley. Thanks for the invitation to be on your show.
So you're still in New York. I understand the fast ended last night?
That's right. We broke fast after being with people in front of the United Nations throughout the weekdays and also on Saturday. And we know that sort of following up on this action, there are people in Chicago and in Fresno, California getting actions ready, and also we were accompanied by people in D.C. doing some very creative actions.
So describe the conditions of your fast. Was it bread and water, or what did you do?
Well, there was, I think, about 15 people who were taking only liquids. And, you know, by the end of 6 days of not having any solid foods, you do become hungry. Hungry as horses, my friend Brian Terrell put it. But, you know, it's so important then for us to recognize there are people who've gone for months without food, watching their children starve, trying to migrate to places where they hope they might be met by humanitarian aid, and they get there and there's nothing. Iona Craig talked about people who were eating the trees. They were so hungry.
Mm. How many were involved in the protest day to day at the UN?
I think there were about 30 to 40 people each day. One day we had 45. A very lively marching band came one day and played. It worked. They did songs kind of clamoring, yearning for mercy and peace and justice. And then a woman did a very interesting dance. And members of the Yemeni community joined us at various points. And we had excellent speakers, people who so generously went out of their way to come down and be with us. For instance, William Hartung, one of the best experts on U.S. weaponry. And we were also joined by Luke Nephew of the Peace Poets. And there are YouTube videos up that people could go and see. There's a very moving one where Amy Nee and her child Eli, who is in her arms, talk about the conditions of parents who can't feed their children. And Amy says she can't imagine it. She couldn't bear it.
Hmm. Now, I saw some of the signs and banners. We put them up on the Struggle TV. Could you say some of the slogans, perhaps, that were on these signs?
Well, one slogan was that there are no military solutions in Yemen. And then we were also so aware that the United States is slashing humanitarian aid budgets to assist the UN in helping not only Yemen but also Nigeria and South Sudan and Somalia, where there's a trio of famines that are now developing. They're near famine conditions now. So feed the hungry, and whatsoever you do to the least of these, which would have some resonance with some of the people who are familiar with Christian scriptures. We had Yemen is starving as one of our slogans, and we felt like, you know, we're fasting for Yemen because Yemen is starving is a simple part of the message, but also no military attacks on Yemen and lift the blockade. Mm-hmm. A number of us were involved in trying to break the economic sanctions against Iraq when that whole country was placed under siege, more or less, and so many people died because of starvation and disease, including hundreds of thousands of children, maybe 500,000 children just under the age of 5. And so now we're looking again at a similar crisis, and instead of the nations of the world saying, how can we help these children who may die this tortuous death by starvation, people have imposed a blockade. The Saudis and the U.S. particularly have, the U.S. collaborating, have imposed a blockade on a major port, one which imports 70% of Yemen's food. Yemen imports 90% of its food, but 70% of it comes through the port of Hodeidah. And the Saudis have arranged a naval blockade, and they've destroyed every crane that would have lifted food from the boats into the trucks and allowed the transport. The Yemenis don't have enough fuel to put gas in their vehicles and move needed goods. And besides the blockade, there have been constant airstrikes, and now the United States has also been making strikes, such as the one in Al Rayal, when the Navy SEAL, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Owen, was killed, and the tragedy for that family certainly begs condolence. But what about the 29 Yemeni civilians who were killed?
And they wiped out that town, I understand, in the weeks afterwards.
Yeah, and people, sometimes the drone operators talk about people who run away from bombings as scorchers.
Yeah.
Well, that's a terrible term in and of itself, scorchers. But the report on Al Rayal that we read, that Iona Craig helped to file, writing for The Intercept, said that a mother and her children were running away. Of course she would run, and then they were killed.
Terrible.
So that never gets mentioned when the United States media people are filming and listening to a 4-minute standing ovation to offer condolence to the widow of the Chief Petty Officer Navy SEAL who was killed in the middle of a horrendous night raid operation. There's no mention of the civilian Yemenis who experienced a nightmare and are bereaved and don't have breadwinners and must flee and become refugees.
Now, getting back to your protests, did passers-by stop and talk to you? Any UN diplomats?
We did find that there was quite a lot of conversation. Some people came back and joined us the next day. One young woman brought her mother with her. People took our flyers. We needed to reproduce the flyers every day. We didn't find, I think maybe once we heard somebody say, get a job. But otherwise, I think the response was one of concern. And one UN worker said, I can't identify myself, but I sit next to the person who works on issues regarding Yemen. And my colleagues' heads are in their hands, and they feel great remorse, and they're very, very grateful that all of you are out here.
Good. How about media coverage by left media or corporate media?
Well, Democracy Now! Invited me to be on their show, and I believe that their segment specifically on Yemen will be on their website. They also had paid a lot of attention to the massive ordnance air charger bomb that had been dropped in Afghanistan. And then I guess I had about 6 or 7 other interviews, Madison, Portland, Jeremy Scahill with The Intercept, and sorry, the other places are escaping me, but there was alternative media coverage, and things have gone out on YouTube. In terms of the mainstream press, we have very, very little expectation of coverage.
Right. Now, you have a Facebook page. I believe it's called Fasting for Yemen. Is that right?
I think so, right.
And I was impressed. You posted a video from a Yemeni American who talked about what was going on internally in Yemen and explained that while what the Saudis were doing was awful, that didn't mean that the Houthis and Salah forces were positive themselves.
I mean, the country has been ripped apart by a very savage civil war. Certainly we agree with the UN people who say silence the guns to all sides, silence the guns. Some people have wondered if there might even be, during the month of Ramadan coming up in June of this year, a call for a ceasefire. I don't think it's the I don't think it's the right of the United States to say who should get the upper hand in any of these civil wars that are raging around the world. But I do hope that the United Nations could play a role in bringing all sides together to seek negotiation, and that all of us can say militarism is not the answer for Yemen. And then, we in the United States have to deal with the fact that we've given, over the years, $315 billion of weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, $115 billion under the Obama administration. And the United States has assisted with the refueling of jets in the air. These are weaponized planes that fire at Yemenis. The United States has helped with the blockade and by giving its tacit approval. So I think we are complicit here in the United States with war crimes, usage of conventional weaponry against civilian people that are occurring in Yemen. And exactly the opposite should be done. The money should be spent on humanitarian relief, I think, assisting the United Nations in its desperate call. They've only raised a fifth of what's needed. And the United States should be calling for negotiations by all sides and using as much of its diplomatic initiative and potential as it can, as should any other major countries who seem to be involved: Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates.
I understand. Now, you made reference to being on Democracy Now! And talking about that huge so-called MOAB bomb that Trump dropped on Afghanistan. And you've been living in Afghanistan on and off. And have you heard anything since Friday about the effects of the bomb on perhaps civilians or the area?
Well, I came back on April 6th, and I can tell you that without a massive bomb destroying water systems, making water so full of horrible chemicals that it won't be drinkable, wrecking up arable land, and creating so much panic and fear, the conditions were already very, very bleak and bad. The air in Kabul, the capital city, is just terrible, and I was glad, actually, that I only spent a brief time there in winter, selfishly, just because your lungs can't take it. The accessibility to potable water is just been zero for people living in refugee camps, and there are 1.5 million people displaced within Afghanistan living in wretched, squalid camps. Well, why do people go to the camps? They hear explosions. They don't know which side is gaining the upper hand. They're terrified, and they run. And I was with people who'd fled from Kunduz, and an elderly woman, raised her arm and showed me the scar underneath her arm, and then she just clung to me. She said, "There's no bread for the children. I have nothing to give them for lunch or for dinner." And the only way they're getting food is to send the children off to work in the markets and hope they might come back with a pittance and maybe some scraps of turnips and potatoes. So people are already, in many places, living a miserable existence. Now, closer to where that bomb was dropped, there are towns and villages, and people have mosques and schools, and so it isn't as though it was a completely remote place. But can you imagine that the United States military would claim, "Oh, well, we made sure there wouldn't be any civilian deaths"? Well, that seems like an outrageous idea when you're going to drop a bomb with a 1-mile radius, and it's the largest non-nuclear bomb the United States has ever used.
Yeah, pretty awful. And they say, 36 enemy were killed, and they say 94 enemy. I mean, where do they? These people are supposedly in the caves. How do they come up with this? I believe they just make up these numbers. But
you really have to wonder. And I mean, we were told there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that warranted a shock and awe bombing. And there were no weapons of mass destruction to be found. So now we're told there were tunnels, and perhaps now maybe they've been blown up and nobody will be able to investigate. But it seems like that what really mattered, what I say is that greed is the mother of all bombs, although it's wrong to use the term mother. But I think it's greed that motivates the development and the usage of these weapons. And they want to try them out. They want to say to the rest of the world, look what we have. But then, other countries are going to start getting comparable weapons. Apparently Russia has a vacuum bomb. When we think of the dire situation the planet is in with global warming, it's insane to be pouring money into these weapon systems, and so it's imperative that the leadership of countries all around the world start to come together and form relations that allow them to talk with each other. And since they don't seem to be making big moves to do that, then we have our responsibilities as ordinary ordinary people to keep trying to generate conversation so that we know there are real people in these faraway places that the United States can cavalierly throw bombs at.
Thank you very much, Kathy Kelly, for speaking. And listeners should know one place to hear more about the Saudi-U.S. war against Yemen is on the site of the Coalition Against the U.S.-Saudi Alliance, and the site is saudius.org. Well, Kathy, thank you again for speaking with me.
Thank you very much, Stanley. Have a good day now.
You too.